They said the story didn't exist, that after the war, after the smoke and the sorrow and the surrender, certain ledgers went missing, certain names could no longer be located, and certain memories were to be spoken of only in hushed winter kitchens, if at all. In Wilkinson County, Mississippi, silence was its own kind of monument. It didn't need marble or an inscription, it just needed time. But silence has a weight, and sometimes the floorboards give way. In 1962, an attic was being emptied 3 states away, a summer of dust, hornets in the rafters, and cardboard boxes that had outlived the people who packed them. A woman, a distant niece by marriage to a family few remembered, wrestled a trunk from a corner so tight the wood had bruised the wall. It was locked. The key was long gone. She pried it open with a flathead screwdriver and a stubborn resolve, and inside lay a stack of books wrapped in a moth-eaten shawl, brown, sun-spotted, and bound in leather that had dried into the texture of bark. The spines cracked like old knuckles when she lifted them. The first page rasped loose under her thumb, and what she read was not a recipe or a hymnal or a ledger of fence posts and notes. It was arithmetic on human lives. The Jessup ledgers did not shout. They did not sermonize. In the neat hand of a man who believed himself practical, they recorded births and bodies the way a broker tracks shipments, dates, sex, soundness, projected value at maturity. There were columns for rations and yards of cloth. A margin note here and there, J direct line. It took the finder time to realize what that meant, and longer still to accept it. History is often a matter of what the paper decides to remember. After the Civil War, county clerks across the South lived with contradictions stapled to their days, swearing oaths to the Union while comforting neighbors who grieved a disappearing social order, balancing the need for new records with a recurring impulse to clean up the old ones. In Wilkinson County, certain courthouse volumes from the 1,852nd land transfers, estate filings, bills of sale bear gaps as clean and suggestive as missing teeth. Pages are damaged by water. Lines that should continue into the next day simply stop. A clerk's flourish trails into nothing. And then, a new hand, a new pen, a new story that pretends to know nothing of the old one. The Jessup plantation all but evaporated from those public pages. There was an acreage noted, then a sale. A widow's pension claim denied for lack of documentation. The small bureaucratic gestures of forgetting, and yet the land remained. The black loam along a bend of road northeast of Woodville. The pecans that still dropped their green-tinged shells in October. The shallow depression where a cotton gin once stood and burned. People driving by would have seen pasture, a few fence posts leaning like tired men, and thought the place ordinary. It had learned to wear ordinary like a mask. To understand what the ledgers meant, you have to understand what the county wanted to hide. Wilkinson was cotton country fields laid out like chessboards, rain that could make or ruin men in a single season, and a planter class that dressed its violence in manners. The Jessups fit the costume. A Greek revival house with white columns and a piano in the parlor. A mother who chaired benevolent societies. A father who nodded solemnly in the front pew on Sundays. Their world was a choreography visiting hours, church bells, a supper at 6 that could fool even its dancers into believing it was decency. But choreography can also conceal. The counted steps, the rehearsed smile, the pivot away from the truth. When the ledgers surfaced, archivists recognized what they were before they admitted it aloud. Here, in the chill of a university reading room, the past was suddenly not a debate or a rumor, not a tale burnt to ash by time, but black ink in straight lines. The entries began in the mid-1830s, when the Jessup's enslaved population numbered in the 40s, adequate by the brutal arithmetic of the era, but never enough. Prices for enslaved workers had climbed, purchase carried risk, death erased investment. The ledgers show a change in strategy, a quiet turn inward. If the market made labor expensive, then labor would have to be made at home. No dramatic confession opens these books. The transformation presents itself as a sequence of notations that slowly become a pattern. A young woman's name appears with the word expecting. Then, 2 pages later, delivered mail, sound, strong cry. A value penciled in as if estimating a yearling's future. Month by month, year by year, the pattern replicates itself, and the margins begin to bloom with those chilling marks, J direct line code, for something the courthouse could omit, but the house could not. A dominance so complete, it mistook itself for good management. Behind the figures were rooms, a study where a man hunched over a desk, tallying futures as if they belonged to him. A parlor where visiting wives remarked on the drapes and did not ask about the cabins beyond the hedges. A nursery where white children learned their alphabets while enslaved children learned their chores. The plantation's rhythm, its visible order, covered all this like a balm that numbs the wound while leaving the infection intact. If this sounds unreal, too monstrous for a family so admired, remember that the antebellum South manufactured the unreal into routine. Laws made bondage legal, money made it sensible, etiquette made it polite. What the Jessops perfected, and what the ledgers prove, was not an aberration so much as a concentrated dose of a broader poison. They did not invent forced reproduction, they systematized it, giving it ledgers and targets, a calendar and an inventory of wombs. And the county, its clerks, its brokers, its elders nodding on courthouse benches, found it easier not to know. The woman who opened that trunk in 1962 could have done what the county did. She could have called a cousin, laughed about old junk, and left the books to feed silverfish and heat. Instead, she wrapped them in new paper and took them to a librarian who knew exactly which phone to answer in a quiet voice. The books were catalogued and boxed, a sterile process that belied the heat still trapped in those lines. And yet, even as they were preserved, a new kind of silence gathered an academic hush, the way archives turn screams into citations. But if you listen, really listen, you can hear what the ink cannot say. You can hear the gap between a recorded birth and an erased mother, the distance between a valuation at 12 years and the child who survived to reach it. You can hear Sunday bells carrying across fields where no one is permitted to speak without permission. You can hear the county clerk closing a volume with satisfied care, as if a clean page were a clean conscience. The Jessop case did not resurface because anyone suddenly found their courage. It resurfaced because paper is stubborn, because truth will hide itself inside the habits of bureaucrats, their love of columns and dates and weight. It will wait through a war and its aftermath, through Reconstruction and Jim Crow, through the long American habit of stepping around the thing in the middle of the room. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, a lid will resist and then give, and the past will breathe. So we begin here, not with the first act of cruelty, but with the proof that cruelty can dress itself as paperwork. We begin with a courthouse that could remember deeds and forget people, with a plantation that could host prayer and plan atrocity under the same roof, with ledgers that balanced columns and unbalanced souls. The county tried to leave us a smooth story. The trunk left us the truth. Now, return with me to Mississippi in 1835, when Isaiah Jessop counted cotton by the bale and people by the womb, when a young wife named Ruth believed that duty could baptize anything, when a house, perfect in its symmetry, began to sponsor the arithmetic of nightmares. We will walk through their parlor like guests and through their quarters like ghosts. We will read their entries and then read what the entries refuse. We will measure how a family convinced itself that horror was ordinary and how an entire community found it convenient to agree. Wilkinson County, Mississippi, 1835. The air was thick with cotton dust and the slow, sweet decay of magnolia blossoms. The Jessop plantation lay just beyond the county seat, where the dirt roads turned pale and dry in the heat, stretching into 1,200 acres of carefully measured ambition. At its center stood the Jessop House, white columns, green shutters, and a broad veranda facing west toward the fields that made and unmade men. To a passerby, it was beautiful. To those who lived inside, it was order, an order built on bondage. Isaiah Jessop had purchased the land 6 years earlier, in 1829, using inheritance money from his father, a tobacco merchant from Virginia who'd grown wealthy, supplying Southern armies with provisions during the early frontier conflicts. At 31, Isaiah was handsome in the way ambition can be mistaken for character. He kept his hair short, his books balanced, and his eyes fixed on the arithmetic of the soil. He had no patience for poetry, only for results. His wife, Ruth Candish Jessop, came from older money. Her father's rice plantation near Charleston had been run with military precision, and she brought that same sense of hierarchy into her new home. In Charleston, Ruth had been educated music, scripture, a little French, but what she had truly learned was power. She learned it from the veranda, where her mother took tea while enslaved women moved like shadows through the yard. She learned that charity was a performance and cruelty, when performed with calm hands, could be mistaken for discipline. When she married Isaiah, she carried her trousseau, her Bible, and her father's most enduring lesson. That profit is the only form of grace God consistently rewards. The plantation they built together grew cotton, mostly with smaller gardens for vegetables and fruit. By 1835, they owned 42 enslaved people, a modest number by the standards of Mississippi's largest planters, but more than enough to mark the Jessops as respectable. They attended church every Sunday in Woodville. They entertained the county's better families twice a month. They read newspapers from Natchez, kept up with cotton prices, and raised their 5 children as though the world outside their gates were the natural order of things. Isaiah saw himself as a practical man, not a cruel one. He kept records, paid his debts, and quoted scripture when convenient. But numbers, for him, were never innocent. He counted everything: bales, barrels, mouths, and births. Each ledger line was a measure of how much his world owed him. The problem, as he saw it, was not morality, it was math. By the mid-1832s, the price of enslaved labor was climbing. A strong field hand cost between $800 and $1,200 more than some planters could pay in 2 years of profit. When disease, accident, or age took a life, it wasn't grief. Isaiah felt it was loss of capital. His ledgers grew anxious, his calculations restless. He wasn't the first to notice. In those years, whispers passed through the parlors of planters that the wealthiest estates no longer depended on auctions, that they grew their own labor. A euphemism, natural increase. It meant breeding. Some owners encouraged marriages among enslaved couples, pairing strong women with strong men. Some arranged pairings like livestock. And then, there were those who went further. Ruth had seen it before. Her father's overseer had once explained the system over supper. A pairing chart pinned on the back wall of his office, lines connecting names like a grotesque family tree. The overseer bragged about how many healthy infants were born that year. Her father had nodded approvingly. Ruth hadn't flinched. She'd been 16, and her world had already taught her not to. So when Isaiah came to her with a new idea in the winter of 1834, she listened without surprise. He'd been pacing for days, chewing on numbers and sermons, his study thick with candle smoke. "We are buying what we could be creating," he said finally, his voice low, almost tender, as if he were offering her a gift. Ruth asked what he meant. He meant exactly that the plantation should no longer depend on outside purchases. "The law is clear," he told her, his tone turning clinical. "The child inherits the condition of the mother. If our family were to participate, the offspring would be ours by right. Born into service, but of strong blood. Half Jessup." He framed it as an investment strategy. "We would produce a stronger stock," he said, "sound, obedient, and loyal. The family blood would ensure it." Ruth sat very still. She was 6 months pregnant with their 3rd child, Margaret. Outside, the cicadas were screaming against the cold air of early winter. Isaiah continued speaking, his words measured, rational, obscene in their composure. She didn't answer that night. She didn't scream, or faint, or condemn him. Instead, she prayed. For weeks, she carried the idea like a sickness. She remembered her father's plantations, the overseer's charts. She remembered the way her mother's voice trembled with pride when saying, "We are self-sustaining." And then, one morning, Ruth came down to breakfast and said, simply, "If it is to be done, it will be done as a family." Isaiah smiled as if she had just agreed to a business partnership. He reached for her hand across the table. "Then we are agreed," he said. That sentence would define the next 23 years of their lives and destroy everything that bore their name. From that day, the plantation changed in quiet ways. The children's lessons shifted. At dinner, Isaiah began using new words: duty, continuance, family enterprise. He spoke of enslaved women not as servants but as resources of future value. Ruth nodded, repeating the language until it began to sound moral. Their eldest son, Thomas, was only 3 at the time. Too young to understand the conversation, but not too young to absorb the tone, the calm certainty that some lives existed to serve others. Over the years, Ruth refined the household into a machine of control. Meals were served at exact times. Servants moved silently. The children addressed enslaved people by their first names only, never with titles. "You must see them as part of the estate," she instructed. "They are not like us, and yet they belong to us." The plantation became a theater of ritualized dominance. Sunday service in Woodville, then dinner with neighbors who spoke about cotton prices while avoiding the word slavery altogether. Behind their smiles, Everyone knew what the others were doing. They just didn't speak of it. Isaiah's obsession deepened. At night, he studied the account books until his candle burned low. He recorded ages, fertility, survivability. He ran figures on birth spacing and the financial return of each child raised to working age. He began to see patterns, breeding cycles, seasonal rhythms. He told himself he was solving a problem. By 1835, when their daughter Margaret was born, the Jessops were ready to begin their experiment. It would start quietly, so quietly that even their neighbors, who prided themselves on knowing everyone's sins, would have no cause to gossip. To the world, the Jessops were the perfect Southern family, a mother in lace gloves arranging flowers for the parlor table, a father reading the newspaper on the veranda, children learning verses from the family Bible while enslaved women ironed their clothes. Inside, a plan was forming, a system so cold, so perfectly rationalized, that even its architects no longer recognized it as evil. Isaiah and Ruth did not think of themselves as monsters. They thought of themselves as visionaries. And every nightmare needs someone willing to believe that. Next, we will step inside their house, where the children of this vision were raised, and learn how obedience, when taught early enough, can make even horror look like destiny. From the outside, the Jessop plantation seemed like any other southern estate, a white-columned mansion set against the backdrop of endless fields, where cicadas hummed over the hum of labor. But inside that house, something was being built. Not just wealth, not just a family, a machine, one powered by obedience, faith, and fear. The Jessop children were raised inside that machine. They never saw it for what it was. Thomas, the eldest, born in 1831, was the center of his father's attention. Isaiah spoke to him as though he were an apprentice, not a son. Even at 6 years old, Thomas was expected to walk beside his father through the fields, to learn which enslaved men worked best in which rows, which women were most productive, which ones needed correction. Samuel followed 2 years later, quieter, more sensitive, often lingering behind his brother, uncertain whether to imitate him or hide from him. Then came Margaret in 1835, Daniel in 1837, and Elizabeth in 1839, 5 children in 8 years. Each one absorbed the same lessons, whispered in different tones, but carrying the same poison. Your family's prosperity depends on control. Their tutor, Charles Whitfield, came from Kentucky, a polite man in spectacles who taught the usual subjects: reading, arithmetic, scripture. He was paid well and asked few questions. Every morning he gathered the Jessop children in the study, where sunlight fell through lace curtains onto slates and chalk dust. He read from the Bible, from Psalms, from Corinthians. "Servants, obey your masters," he would recite, "for this is right in the sight of the Lord." Isaiah would nod approvingly from the doorway. The plantation was its own universe. The children rarely left it. Their only glimpse of other lives came on Sundays when they rode to church in Woodville. From their pew, they watched the preacher thunder about virtue, while enslaved people stood at the back, heads bowed, invisible in plain sight. Inside the Jessop home, slavery wasn't discussed, it was assumed. Ruth made sure of that. She ran the household like a convent of order and obedience. The children were forbidden to play with the enslaved children. "They are not your kind," she would say, her tone gentle but final. "They have their purpose, and we have ours." At supper, the talk was of crops, weather, and family duty. Isaiah would speak of management, of investments, of the family's future. The words meant more than money. They meant the system he was preparing them to inherit. He wanted them to understand young before compassion could take root. By the late 1832, Isaiah had begun to condition Thomas for what he called the responsibilities of a man. He showed him ledgers, account books, and maps. He explained the value of a worker at birth, at age 10, at age 20. He taught him to calculate life as if it were inventory. Thomas's small hands traced the columns of numbers, his mind filling with lessons no child should learn. At the dinner table, Isaiah spoke freely about the enslaved population. He compared them to crops, to animals, to capital. He discussed the strong backs and good breeding lines of his people the same way he talked about horses. The children listened, wide-eyed, absorbing the logic until it sounded normal. By the time Thomas was 10, he had stopped asking why people were bought or sold. And yet, there were moments, brief, fragile moments, when the facade cracked. One night, during a thunderstorm, Margaret, then about 5 years old, wandered into her mother's room, frightened by the sound of rain striking the windows. Ruth was sewing by candlelight, her face calm, her movement steady. "Mama," Margaret whispered, "why do the people in the cabins never come inside when it rains?" Ruth didn't look up. "Because they are used to it," she said softly. "It is their place." The next morning, Margaret asked the same question to the house servant who brushed her hair, an older woman named Claudia. Claudia's hands froze for a moment in her curls. "Because," she whispered, "they are not allowed." Margaret didn't repeat that answer to anyone. But something small, quiet, and dangerous was planted in her mind that day, a question that would take 20 years to bloom. Isaiah's lessons continued. When Thomas turned 13, Isaiah took him deeper into the business of ownership. He showed him how to evaluate strength, how to watch for illness, how to punish without anger, but with precision. "A man must learn control," he said, "over himself and over others." By 16, Thomas was more bookkeeper than boy. Then came May of 1848, humid, heavy, and unforgettable. Thomas turned 17. That night after dinner, Isaiah called him into the study. Ruth was already there, seated by the fire, her embroidery untouched in her lap. The room smelled faintly of whiskey and candle wax. "Son," Isaiah began, "you are a man now, and it is time you fulfill your duty to this family." Thomas nodded, unsure what he meant. A pause. The ticking of the mantel clock filled the silence. Then Isaiah said a name, Hannah. She was a young woman from the kitchen staff, about 20 years old, known for her quietness and her soft singing while she worked. "She will be brought to your room tonight," Isaiah said, as if discussing a delivery. "You will not refuse. It is your responsibility now." Thomas's breath caught. He stared at his father, searching for something in his face, kindness, hesitation, maybe shame, but found only calm resolve. Ruth spoke next. "You will do as your father instructs. This is the way our family ensures its future. It is not sin if it is done for the good of the household." Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled on the embroidery hoop. That night, the house was silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. Hannah was brought to Thomas's room. What happened there was not written in any family diary, only recorded in Isaiah's ledger 3 months later. May 1849, Hannah delivered a male child. Sound, strong cry, property of Jessup Plantation. Value estimated at $400 at maturity. A line, a child, a life reduced to ink. Thomas said nothing afterward. He worked the fields, oversaw repairs, and avoided his father's gaze. When Hannah passed him in the hallway, she kept her eyes low. Within months, she was pregnant again, this time by Isaiah himself. The pattern had begun, and as the years rolled forward, one by one, each Jessup child would be absorbed into it. Samuel would follow Thomas's path. Margaret and Elizabeth would be taught that bearing children for the family was a sacred duty. Daniel, the youngest son, would one day become his father's mirror. From the parlor to the nursery, the gospel of duty was preached with soft voices and gentle smiles. The horror was never shouted, it was whispered. By the time the Jessup children reached adulthood, they no longer knew where decency ended and obedience began. They were ready to become exactly what Isaiah and Ruth had planned, instruments of a system that mistook atrocity for order. The machine was running, and no one inside the house could hear the screams beneath its hum. By 1849, the Jessup plantation no longer needed to buy people, it was producing them. Isaiah's experiment, his system, as he preferred to call it, was functioning with the precision of a well-oiled mill. The ledgers in his study thickened with each season. Where once there had been lists of expenses and crop yields, there were now pages of human births, columns for mothers, columns for fathers, weights, skin tone, and remarks written in that careful, upright hand. Healthy, male, strong limbs. Female, light complexion, promising. Each entry ended with the same note. Property of Jessup Plantation. Isaiah had become an architect of flesh and lineage, convinced that he was building an inheritance too refined to fail. In his mind, he was no longer merely a cotton planter. He was a patriarch of bloodlines, blood that would enrich his fields, his future, and his God. Ruth supervised the domestic side of the operation. To her, the birthing and breeding were not acts of cruelty, but of management. She kept records of pregnancies, diets, and illnesses. She spoke of care and nurture, the way a gardener speaks of soil. When an enslaved woman was with child, Ruth ensured she ate better and worked lighter, not out of kindness but because healthy births meant higher returns. When the infants came, they were taken almost immediately from their mothers. By law, every one of them belonged to the Jessops. Mothers were allowed to hold their newborns briefly, sometimes for a day, sometimes an hour, before older women in the quarters carried them away. The plantation's midwife, a woman named Claudia, tended to them, feeding the babies from whatever milk could be spared. She kept them alive, knowing full well she was preserving the very system that broke her heart. To Isaiah, Claudia's role was invaluable. To Claudia, it was unbearable. From dawn until dusk, the plantation moved like clockwork. The field hands rose in darkness, their bodies aching from the previous day. Overseers barked orders. The cotton gin rattled and groaned, grinding through harvests that stained the air with lint and dust. Beyond the fields, in cabins arranged with geometric precision, women nursed babies born of violation, trying to quiet their cries before an overseer's attention turned cruel. Every sound had a rhythm. The whip, the saw, the bell for meals, the rustle of ledger pages turning in Isaiah's study. The plantation had become an organism that consumed life and spat out profit. In 1850, Samuel turned 17. The same conversation that had marked his brother's passage into manhood was repeated word for word. "It is your duty," Isaiah told him. "Our family depends on this." Samuel obeyed, but something in him resisted. He drank whiskey from the decanters in his father's study at night, staring at the ledgers until the numbers blurred. His mother scolded him for weakness. His father warned him that sentiment was sin, but the guilt never left him. By the time Daniel reached adolescence, resistance had vanished entirely. He accepted his role with mechanical indifference. He had been shaped by a house where human compassion was treated as a flaw, and the daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth, were not exempt. Ruth had trained them from childhood to see motherhood as duty. But when Margaret turned 18, that lesson took on a horrifying literalness. Isaiah selected an enslaved man named Jacob, a blacksmith, strong, healthy, with what Isaiah called fine features. Jacob was brought to Margaret's room one Saturday night. Ruth stayed in the next room, praying aloud. 9 months later, Margaret gave birth to a daughter. The child was not hers to keep. Ruth took the baby to Claudia, who wrote another line in Isaiah's book. The act repeated itself again and again. Margaret bore 4 children between 1,853 and 1,857. Each one was marked in the ledgers with the same careful detail, the same valuation. Her body became another resource, an extension of the plantation's machinery. Elizabeth followed the same path 2 years later. The system was complete. Isaiah had become obsessed with optimization. He rotated partners, calculated spacing between pregnancies, even experimented with diets and rest cycles. He took notes on everything, convinced that breeding people was no different from breeding livestock. He marked the children born from his own assaults with a discrete symbol, J direct line. He believed these children were superior, stronger, smarter, closer to what he called refined stock. By 1855, there were 68 enslaved people on the Jessup plantation, 26 of them children under the age of 10. The population had nearly doubled since the breeding began. The profits had too. Isaiah expanded the estate, buying 300 additional acres. He built a new barn, additional slave quarters, and a cotton gin building that roared like thunder through the summer nights. To the outside world, he was a success story. Other planters admired him, called him efficient. He served on the county agricultural board and gave speeches about Southern enterprise. At church, he spoke kindly of providence. God rewards diligence, he told the congregation. But behind the white pillars and polished sermons, his house was a sanctum of desecration. The enslaved people knew it. They lived it. Some tried to resist. In 1851, a woman named Sarah attempted to run away after being forced to bear her 3rd child by Samuel. She made it 17 miles before being captured by slave patrols. They dragged her back barefoot, her feet raw and bleeding. Isaiah ordered her whipped publicly 10 lashes in front of the quarters. Then she was locked in a shed for 2 weeks, fed nothing but cornbread and water. When she was released, she spoke no more, not a word. For the rest of her life, she moved like a shadow, silent and hollow-eyed, until pneumonia took her in 1863. Her name appears once more in Isaiah's ledger that year. Deceased, no issue, loss recorded. The cruelty was efficient, but it wasn't sustainable. The enslaved people began to whisper after dark, in cabins lit only by coals. They told their children stories of freedom, whispered from plantation to plantation, of men and women who fled north under the cover of storms. They sang songs whose meanings Isaiah could not hear, though the sound carried through the open windows of his grand house at night. In those songs were messages, directions, names, and promises. The Jessup children, grown now, heard them too. Some ignored them, some couldn't. Samuel drank more. Margaret wept alone in her room. Thomas turned to his ledgers with an almost priest-like devotion, finding order in numbers when the world around him began to feel like chaos. But the system rolled on, grinding through lives as steadily as the cotton gin. Each birth recorded, each body measured, each soul reduced to an entry in Isaiah's careful hand. And as the years passed, the Jessup plantation became something far worse than a place of labor. It became a laboratory of control, a world where every scream could be converted into profit, every act of violence justified as necessity. And still, the neighbors looked away, because to acknowledge what was happening just a few miles down the road would mean admitting what they all already knew, that the entire South was built on the same foundation, the arithmetic of flesh. By 1856, the Jessup plantation had reached its peak, fields full, ledgers balanced, barns expanded. On paper, Isaiah Jessup was one of the most prosperous men in Wilkinson County, but behind the symmetry of his empire, rot had begun to spread, not in the soil, nor in the crops, but in the minds of those forced to live beneath his roof. The first cracks appeared in his children. Thomas, now 25, was the heir apparent, the image of his father in both posture and tone. He walked the grounds each morning, inspected the workers, noted who coughed, who limped, who slowed down under the heat. He was efficient, composed, and hollow. The childhood spark that once made him laugh at clouds had long been extinguished. Samuel, meanwhile, had become the plantation's embarrassment. His drinking, once a private indulgence, had grown into a daily necessity. He spent hours alone in the smokehouse, the bottle of corn whiskey his only confidant. When he stumbled through the house, muttering half prayers and half confessions, Ruth ordered the servants to avoid him. Isaiah threatened him with disinheritance. "Your weakness shames us all." Isaiah hissed one night when Samuel returned drunk to supper. Samuel said nothing at first, his eyes dull, his hands trembling. Then, softly, he said the one thing Isaiah could not bear to hear. "Father, you have built a hell and called it home." Isaiah struck him across the face. From that night forward, Samuel rarely spoke. He performed his duties mechanically, driven not by belief but by fear. But inside, he was unraveling. Margaret, too, was fading. Since her fourth childbirth, she had grown fragile, her skin pale, her eyes distant. Some nights, she sat by the window for hours, staring toward the cabins where the cries of newborns carried through the humid dark. Ruth told her to pray, to remember her duty, to be grateful for the blessings of family. But Margaret's prayers turned into whispers of guilt. She began refusing meals, locking herself in her room, trembling at the sound of her father's footsteps. Her mother mistook it for feminine weakness. Her father called it defiance. When Isaiah's temper rose, the entire house fell silent. He had become a man divided, part plantation master, part accountant, part zealot, convinced that God himself approved his system. His letters from this period, many later recovered, show no remorse, only pride in efficiency. This year's increase, 9 births, 7 surviving, projected value, $5,200. To him, that was success. But outside the walls of his study, something unseen was shifting. The enslaved community had begun to lose its fear. The old midwife, Claudia, who had raised generations of children in captivity, felt it first. She heard it in the tone of whispered hymns that weren't just about salvation anymore, but about escape. She saw it in the way younger men carried themselves, standing a little taller, looking the overseers in the eye. The plantation had grown too large to control. The older ones remembered the early years of Isaiah's reign and carried their terror quietly. But the younger ones, those born of the breeding program, knew no life beyond the plantation and no loyalty to the family that enslaved them. Among them was Josiah, a strong young man of 26, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken, who worked in the fields by day and gathered information by night. He had learned to read, secretly, from an old Bible discarded by Ruth's church group. He knew the words deliverance and freedom, and he held them like fire in his chest. Isaiah's iron control could not smother the ember of rebellion that was beginning to glow. Then, in the spring of 1000, 857, an outsider came, a Methodist minister named William Foster, traveling through Mississippi to report on conditions in the South. He was welcomed as a guest, offered brandy and a feather bed, and invited to dine with the Jessup family. At supper, Reverend Foster listened as Isaiah spoke proudly of innovations in plantation management. His tone was smooth, practiced, as if discussing crop rotation rather than human lives. The Reverend nodded politely, but his eyes wandered to the mixed-race children serving food, to the haunted stillness of the enslaved house servants, to Margaret's trembling hands and Samuel's vacant stare. After dinner, Foster walked the veranda alone. From there, he could see the flickering light of the slave quarters in the distance, could hear faint voices singing low, mournful, defiant. He did not sleep that night. The next morning, as he took his leave, Isaiah pressed him for his thoughts. "You see," Isaiah said, smiling, "when a man treats his property wisely, it prospers." Reverend Foster's throat tightened. "I see that you have been very thorough, Mr. Jessup," he said carefully, "but there are things a man cannot own without losing something of his own soul." Isaiah laughed. "The North breeds sentiment, Reverend. The South breeds strength." Foster said nothing more. When he returned home to Pennsylvania, he recorded his suspicions in a small leather-bound journal. His notes would later become one of the few surviving outside accounts of what was happening on the Jessup plantation. "The inhabitants of that house live in moral darkness deeper than any I have witnessed. Their sin is not passion but order. They have made evil efficient." Meanwhile, inside the Jessup household, discipline turned to paranoia. Isaiah began to suspect that some of the enslaved women were plotting disobedience. He increased punishments, cut rations, demanded nightly roll calls. The overseers patrolled with dogs and rifles. Fear hung over the plantation like the mist that clung to the fields each morning. And yet, fear could not hold back decay. Samuel's drinking worsened. Margaret's silence deepened into illness. Even Ruth, once the calm axis of the household, began to fray. She was still outwardly pious, still hosting church ladies, still quoting scripture, but sometimes, late at night, she sat awake, staring at the cradle that had once held her own children. She had begun to wonder if God was listening at all. The enslaved people could sense the change. The house that had once felt like an immovable fortress now trembled at its foundation. Whispers spread. The master's family is cursed, and perhaps they were, for every act of cruelty demands payment. And in Wilkinson County, payment was coming due. It would begin not with rebellion, but with grief, a death inside the Jessup home that would shake even its coldest heart, and with it bring the first collapse of a dynasty built on human suffering. The year 1858 began with heat that would not break. The air hung like wet wool over the fields, pressing down on everything: crops, bodies, tempers. The Jessup plantation, for all its wealth, had become a place of ghosts, a mansion filled with hollow-eyed airs and the unburied cries of the enslaved. Then, one February night, the silence shattered. 3 women, Hannah, Rachel, and Julia, slipped from their cabins under a moon no brighter than a thumbnail. Each carried a scrap of cornbread, a water gourd, and a single thought pulsing in her chest: freedom or death. They moved like shadows along the tree line, careful to avoid the barking of dogs. They were supposed to meet 2 miles north, where a creek cut through the woods. Josiah had shown them the place. He'd whispered the plan during Sunday services when plantation slaves were allowed to attend neighboring churches. Follow the water north. Keep walking until the stars tilt west. Someone will help you. For hours they walked barefoot through mud and briars, hearts pounding, breath shallow. Behind them, the plantation slept, its masters drunk on wealth, its overseers drunk on rum. For a few hours, they believed they had escaped. At dawn, the dogs began to bark. Isaiah's overseer, a man named Cartwright, found the cabins empty. Within minutes, the alarm bell rang, slicing through the humid air. Isaiah appeared on the veranda in his nightclothes, furious. "Bring them back," he commanded. Alive, Thomas and Daniel rode out with 2 trackers and bloodhounds. By mid-afternoon, the dogs caught the scent near the creek. The women were found huddled beneath a fallen tree, their feet torn and bleeding. They did not beg. Brought back in chains, they were dragged to the yard between the main house and the quarters. Every enslaved person on the plantation was ordered to gather. The Jessup family watched from the veranda, the parents seated, the children standing behind them like pale statues. Isaiah stepped forward, whip in hand. "This," he said, his voice calm, "is what happens when good treatment is met with betrayal." Each woman received 10 lashes. The sound echoed like gunshots through the fields. When it was over, Isaiah gave a short speech about loyalty, gratitude, and divine order. Ruth sat expressionless, a handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Thomas looked away. Samuel watched from an upstairs window, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his glass. The women were locked in the storage shed for 3 days with minimal food and water, then sent back to work. Hannah could barely walk. Rachel ran a fever that lingered for weeks. Julia stopped speaking entirely. But something changed that day, something Isaiah couldn't measure in ledgers. The enslaved people began to hate him, not with fear, but with purpose. Samuel broke first. That night, still drunk, he stormed into his father's study. The room smelled of ink and sweat and the iron tang of authority. The ledgers lay open on the desk, as always, columns of births, names, and prices. Samuel slammed his fist onto the table. "They are human beings, father," he shouted. "You've turned this house into a tomb." Isaiah didn't rise. "You will not speak to me in that tone. You've damned us all," Samuel said. "Mother, Margaret, the girls, look at them. Look at what you've made of us." Isaiah's voice was steady, cold. "I made you strong. I gave you a legacy." Samuel laughed bitterly. "You gave me nightmares." Then came the sound of skin meeting skin, a slap. Isaiah struck his son so hard he fell backward against the bookcase. "If you will not fulfill your duty," Isaiah said, "then leave this house tonight and never return." Samuel did. He walked out into the humid dark, mounted his horse, and rode toward Natchez. He never looked back. He would never return. For the Jessup family, his departure was not spoken of again. Isaiah forbade the name to be mentioned, but Ruth cried in private, not for her son's pain, but for what she saw as the shame of his defiance. Margaret, meanwhile, was unraveling completely. In October, after the birth of her 5th child, a boy, she was told she could not keep him. The infant was taken to Claudia, as all the others had been. Margaret screamed until her throat tore, then fell into a silence so deep it frightened even Ruth. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, stared through her reflection in the window, as if seeing something beyond it. One night, Ruth found her with a piece of broken glass pressed to her wrist. "What are you doing?" she demanded, snatching it away. Margaret looked at her mother with empty eyes. Ending it. Ruth locked her in her room for 3 weeks. When Margaret emerged, she was pale and hollow-eyed, moving through the halls like a ghost. Her father called it weakness. Her mother called it hysteria. Neither called it despair. In the quarters, despair had turned to rage. The failed escapes, the punishments, the separations each had left scars, both visible and unseen. Josiah gathered small groups at night, whispering of rebellion. He told them the world was changing. "There are people up north fighting to end this," he said. "There are safe places beyond the river." Some believed him. Some were too afraid. The final breaking point came the following summer, when the cotton harvest failed. The boll weevils came early, devouring the fields. Isaiah's profits collapsed. He needed money, and quickly. So he sold 6 children ranging from 8 to 12 years old to a trader headed for Louisiana. 4 of those children had Jessup blood. Their mothers were not allowed to say goodbye. The screams that morning reached every corner of the plantation. Even the birds went silent. That was when Josiah stopped talking about escape and started talking about war. Small acts of sabotage began. Tools went missing. Wagons broke down mysteriously. One morning, Isaiah found the horses' harnesses cut clean through. He punished 3 men at random. In the eyes of the enslaved, something had changed. The fear that once held them had burned away, leaving only hatred and resolve. Samuel's absence had shaken the family's illusion of control. Margaret's decline turned Ruth into a shadow of herself. Isaiah, isolated and furious, began to sense that the world was slipping away from him. Then, in July, Margaret went into labor again. It was her 6th pregnancy, her body frail and exhausted. The birth lasted through the night. By dawn, the baby was born a boy, alive and crying. Margaret never woke again. She bled out within hours. The plantation fell silent. Even Isaiah didn't speak. Ruth collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably for the first time in her life. Thomas and Daniel stood by the door, unsure what to do. Elizabeth locked herself in her room, screaming into her pillow. Margaret was buried 3 days later under an old oak near the family cemetery. The preacher spoke of mysteries beyond man's understanding. No one spoke of the true cause. After the funeral, Isaiah wrote a single sentence in his ledger: "Margaret Jessup, deceased." Aged age, shitrei, cause, childbirth. He did not mention that the child she died delivering had been conceived through violence, or that the house had lost its last trace of innocence. Ruth changed after that. The iron discipline that had defined her softened into something fragile. She began speaking of punishment gods, not her husband's. "He is watching us," she whispered to Elizabeth one night. "He is counting our sins." Elizabeth, at 20, did not agree. "We have done our duty," she said. "Father is right. We have ensured the family's future." But even Elizabeth, indoctrinated as she was, began to feel the walls closing in. Because the enslaved people were no longer afraid. They had seen one of the masters die, had watched the family crumble, and knew that something larger was coming. They could feel it in the air, the way the wind shifted before a storm, and in that storm, the Jessup family would face the reckoning they had so long believed could never reach them. By the time 1859 dawned, the Jessup plantation was little more than a trembling empire, a grand facade with rot crawling behind every painted wall. The cotton gin rattled on, the ledgers filled with neat, precise handwriting, and yet the house itself had gone quiet. Where laughter once rang through its halls, there was only the sound of wind pushing through cracks in the shutters. The slaves no longer sang in the fields. Their songs, once spirituals of endurance and prayer, had vanished into silence. And that silence terrified Isaiah more than any open act of defiance. He knew something was changing, though he refused to name it. The country itself was changing. In October, word reached Mississippi of a man named John Brown, who had led a failed slave uprising at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The name spread through plantation country like wildfire. Planters whispered of revolt. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the vengeance of the North. Isaiah tightened his grip. He banned all movement off the property. No more Sunday church visits, no errands to town. The enslaved were confined to the plantation, watched day and night by newly hired overseers armed with rifles. Curfews were pushed earlier. Even conversations after dark could lead to whipping. The Jessup plantation, once a place of carefully masked evil, now looked like what it had always been, a prison. Inside the mansion, the family's fractures deepened. Thomas, now the de facto head of operations, had inherited his father's efficiency, but none of his conviction. He followed orders because he did not know how to do otherwise. Yet the weight of the system pressed on him like a fever. Some nights, he could still hear Margaret's voice, her sobs behind the locked door, her scream during childbirth. He tried to drown it with work, with silence. Ruth, hollowed by grief, had become a ghost of herself. Once a woman of perfect poise and control, she now spent long hours sitting by the window with her Bible open but unread, mouthing verses she could no longer believe. In her letters to her sister in South Carolina, letters later recovered, her handwriting trembled. "Perhaps God is punishing us. The more I pray, the more he hides his face. The ledgers that once comforted Isaiah now haunt me. I hear babies crying when the house is quiet. I think they are calling my name." Isaiah found her one night burning those letters in the fireplace. "Do you repent, Ruth?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. She simply stared into the flames. The enslaved people, meanwhile, had begun to move in whispers. Josiah was still there, alive, angry, and patient. He had seen too much to act rashly. He gathered small groups in secret, using broken hymns as code. "Let my people go," they sang. But it was no longer a prayer, it was a map. The spark came on a December night, 3 weeks before Christmas. It began with a smell, smoke, faint at first, then thick, acrid, crawling across the fields. The cotton gin building was ablaze. The fire climbed fast, feeding on dry timber and bales of lint. By the time the alarm was raised, the sky glowed orange. Everyone ran white and black, master and slave alike, forming bucket lines from the well, shouting through the chaos. Thomas led men toward the flames, but the heat drove them back. Sparks leapt to the nearby storage shed. Sparks that once meant hope now became ruin. By dawn, the gin was gone, reduced to smoldering ribs of iron and ash. The loss was catastrophic. Without it, Isaiah could not process cotton, could not trade, could not pay his debts. But what enraged him most was what he found among the ruins, a bundle of oil, soaked rags near the ignition point. It had not been an accident. It was rebellion. The next morning, Isaiah gathered every enslaved person in the yard. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with something beyond rage, a kind of righteous terror. "Someone did this," he said. "Someone destroyed what feeds you, clothes you, gives you life. Until I have the truth, All of you will suffer. No one spoke. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear. When no one confessed, Isaiah selected 3 men at random, Peter, Moses, and James, and ordered them whipped, 20 lashes each. Blood soaked the ground beneath their feet. Still, silence. He told the overseers that until the guilty party was found, punishments would continue, but there was no single guilty party. The fire had been set by 7 men and women together, Josiah among them. They had planned it for weeks, knowing it wouldn't bring freedom, only pain, but they needed Isaiah to feel fear, to feel what they felt every day. He did. That night, Isaiah locked himself in his study, his trembling hands smearing ink across the pages of his ledgers. For the first time in decades, his numbers no longer added up. Thomas approached him quietly. "Father," he said, "this will destroy us. The whippings, the punishments, they make them hate us more." Isaiah's reply was cold and final. "They are not capable of hate. They are property." But even Isaiah knew the lie. The plantation had turned against him. Tools broke mysteriously. Horses were injured. Wagons overturned. Every act of sabotage was small, almost invisible on its own, but together they were a slow, unstoppable revolt. And through it all, Ruth's mind began to fray completely. She started hearing voices, Margaret's, Samuel's, even her own. She stopped attending church, claiming she could see shadows moving at the foot of her bed. One morning, Elizabeth found her sitting in Margaret's empty room, cradling an invisible infant, whispering lullabies to the dead. In January of 1860, she wrote in a final letter to her sister, "I wake to screams that may be real or echoes of years gone. I fear we have sinned past forgiveness. The ground here drinks too much blood." Elizabeth, in contrast, was unshaken. She had absorbed the family doctrine so completely that she saw herself as its savior. At 21, she spoke of continuing the breeding program after her father's death. "It is our duty," she told Ruth. "Our purpose." To Isaiah, her words were a balm. To everyone else, they were madness. By spring, the family's empire was held together only by habit. The ledgers still filled, but fewer births were recorded. Disease swept through the quarters, taking several of the younger children. The cotton fields grew ragged. The overseers whispered that the slaves were waiting for war. And they were right. By the end of 1859, the world beyond Wilkinson County was catching fire. Lincoln's name filled the newspapers. Talk of secession thickened the air. The system that had built Isaiah's fortune was trembling under its own weight. Then, on one cold night in December, someone or something set the plantation's course toward its final judgment. The fire at the cotton gin had been only the beginning. Soon, another fire would come, one that would consume not just Isaiah's crops or buildings, but the very illusion that had sustained the Jessup family for nearly 3 decades. The illusion that they could enslave others without destroying themselves. By the spring of 1860, the Jessup plantation was a mausoleum that still breathed. The ledgers on Isaiah's desk had stopped recording profit and began recording loss of crops, of workers, of faith. The fields were unkempt, the barns sagged, and even the air seemed different, heavy, restless, charged with a sense that history itself was watching. Then came the war. In April 1861, Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter, and the old order cracked like a rotten beam. Wilkinson County buzzed with talk of enlistment and glory. Men who had once dined together as planters now boasted of defending Southern honor. For Isaiah, it was validation. "God will not allow the righteous to fall," he told Ruth, though his voice trembled as he said it. But his sons were gone. Thomas enlisted that same month, joining a Mississippi regiment. He left without looking back at the house, or his father's graveled blessing. Daniel followed a few weeks later, his youthful pride blinding him to what he was defending. Samuel was still missing, his name forbidden in the home. That left only Elizabeth and Ruth to tend to an aging patriarch and a house suffocating under its own ghosts. Ruth had grown frail. Her letters had stopped. She prayed less, spoke less, ate little. When she did speak, her words came in fragments, half-murmured verses about judgment and mercy. She would wander the halls at night with a candle, whispering names no one else dared to say. Elizabeth took control of the household, but she was her father's daughter through and through, cold, obedient, and certain that her role was divine. When Ruth once asked her if she ever doubted the family's past, Elizabeth replied calmly, "We did what was required. God favors those who act without weakness." Isaiah beamed at that. "You have my strength," he said, and my blood. But even Isaiah's strength was faltering. He suffered a stroke in the autumn of 1862, leaving the right side of his body paralyzed. He spent his days in the study, staring at ledgers he could no longer write in, muttering names of slaves who were now gone or dead. The plantation's enslaved population had dwindled, some to illness, some to the whip, and some to the promise whispered from the north, freedom. Rumors began to drift into the quarters, rumors of Lincoln's proclamation, of Union soldiers marching through Mississippi, of black men fighting in blue uniforms. The enslaved people passed these stories in whispers that grew louder each week. For the first time, hope was not a fantasy, but a direction. In April 1863, news reached Wilkinson County of the Emancipation Proclamation. Isaiah refused to believe it. "Paper cannot change the natural order," he said. "God himself wrote the hierarchy of man." But the natural order was collapsing faster than he could imagine. That same month, word came that Thomas had been killed at Shiloh, shot through the chest. Daniel died of dysentery in a Virginia camp less than a year later. Ruth received both notices within months, and that was enough to finish her. One August morning in 1864, Elizabeth found her mother in bed, her hands folded neatly on her chest, her eyes open but empty. Isaiah outlived her by less than a year. The second stroke came in early 1865, leaving him barely able to speak. When Union troops finally rode into Woodville that spring, he was a relic in a chair, watching from his veranda as soldiers read the emancipation orders aloud to the people he still believed were his property. He tried to protest, but only one side of his mouth moved. The officer, young, uniformed, dusty from travel, looked at him without pity. "They're free now," he said simply, and just like that, the system Isaiah had built for 30 years dissolved into air. The enslaved gathered in the yard, some crying, some laughing, some too stunned to react at all. Claudia, the old midwife, led them in a hymn. Oh freedom over me." The song drifted across the fields where so much blood had been spilled. Some left that very day, walking north toward the sound of rumor. Others stayed for a week, uncertain where to go, what a world without chains might look like. Hannah, the first woman Isaiah's son had violated, took her surviving children and walked until her feet bled. She reached Memphis and worked as a washerwoman until her death in 1889. Rachel went west, toward Vicksburg. Julia, broken but alive, followed others to a freedmen's bureau camp near Natchez. Of all the Jessup family, only Elizabeth remained. She buried her father under the oak near Margaret's grave in October 1865. The tombstone read, Isaiah Jessup, 1798, 1865, a devoted husband, father, and steward of the land. There was no mention of the lives he had stolen. Elizabeth tried to maintain the plantation, but the world no longer obeyed her. The freedmen would not return, and the banks would not lend. The cotton gin had never been rebuilt after the fire, and the soil was exhausted from decades of exploitation. Within 2 years, she sold what remained of the property to a northern investor for a fraction of its value and moved to Mobile, Alabama, to live with distant relatives. She died alone in 1891, her family line extinguished. The plantation itself crumbled into ruin. By 1900, little remained but a few foundation stones swallowed by weeds. The fields grew wild again. The slave quarters collapsed into the earth that had once been tilled by the people Isaiah called property. And yet, the memory refused to die. In 1962, nearly a century later, when a descendant of Ruth's sister opened that forgotten trunk in a South Carolina attic, the Jessup ledgers breathed again. Page after page, they detailed the births, the pairings, the valuations, a meticulous account of human lives reduced to assets. Each name a wound, each number a testimony. Historians verified their authenticity. The Jessup breeding program, as it came to be called, became one of the most documented cases of systemic forced reproduction in the American South. The ledgers were joined by letters, county records, and later by the voices of descendants interviewed during the Federal Writers' Project of the 1,930 seconds. One woman, then 85, recalled stories told by her grandmother, who had been born on the plantation. "Mr. Jessup, he say he make people the way he make corn. We was crops, not folks, but we remember. We always remember." Today, the Jessup name survives only in courthouse archives and dusty family Bibles. The land itself is quiet pecan trees reclaiming the soil. vines twisting over what was once a house of order and sin. But if you walk there at dusk, locals say, the wind changes. Some claim they hear voices, women singing low, children laughing, and then fading. The earth itself seems to hum with memory. Perhaps it is only the wind, or perhaps it is the sound of the past refusing to rest, because the true horror of the Jessup story is not that it happened once. It is that it was ordinary. Isaiah Jessup was never charged with a crime. The laws of his time protected him. The churches blessed him. His neighbors praised him. He died believing himself righteous. And that is the lesson the ledgers whisper from their archive boxes even now. That evil does not always come with fire and fury. Sometimes it wears respectability, writes in perfect cursive, and prays before supper. The Jessup plantation was not a nightmare that interrupted the world. It was the world, recorded line by line, in ink that time could not erase.